Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story.
The camera opens on grainy black and white footage. A tired man in an ill-fitting suit shuffles through the corridor of a federal courthouse. Reporters crowd in, microphones thrust forward, flashbulbs exploding in bursts of hard light. His shoulders are stooped. His hair is thinned by age and illness, but the name that follows him into the courtroom still carries weight in whispered conversations and in confidential government memoranda. Angelo DeCarlo. Outside, America in the late 1960s is restless and afraid. The country is wrestling with war abroad and protest at home, and beneath that noise another battle is being fought in quiet offices and smoky hearing rooms. Senators hold televised hearings on organized crime. The FBI releases carefully worded statements about a national crime syndicate. Newspaper headlines speak of labor racketeering, of loan sharking, of murder for hire. Again and again, one of the names that surfaces in those files is DeCarlo. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors talk about a man they describe as a power behind the scenes in New Jersey, someone who moves money through back rooms and union offices, who sits at the crossroads between street-level fear and higher-level influence. Defense lawyers counter that he is a sick old man, a victim of government overreach, never convicted of the worst things alleged against him. Viewers at home see only a brief clip on the evening news, but for those who have spent years tracking him, Angelo DeCarlo represents something larger: the evolution of organized crime from neighborhood gangs into a sophisticated, tightly networked underworld. To understand how a boy born at the dawn of the 20th century became a quiet but feared figure in that hidden world, it is necessary to strip away the later legends and sensational headlines and return to the beginning, to the landscapes, prejudices, and economic pressures that shaped the generation from which he emerged. Angelo DeCarlo entered the world in 1902, in Italy, at a time when the country was still reeling from unification and chronic poverty. The Italy of his birth was not the postcard vision later tourists would know. For millions in the south and center of the peninsula, daily life meant subsistence farming, poor soil, and a rigid social hierarchy that left little room for social mobility. Heavy taxation, limited land, and recurring crop failures affected entire regions, prompting an exodus that would carry families across the Atlantic in search of a better life. Among those families were the DeCarlos. Like countless others, they joined the great tide of Italians who left their villages for ports such as Naples or Genoa, endured a cramped transatlantic voyage in steerage, and arrived in the United States in the first decades of the 20th century. Passenger manifests and immigration records from that era show a flood of newcomers listing laborer as their intended occupation and giving addresses in the crowded tenements of New York and New Jersey. Angelo was still a child when his family stepped into this new world, one in which opportunity and hostility coexisted on the same city block. The United States Angelo encountered was expanding rapidly, but it was not always welcoming. Italian immigrants found themselves clustered in tightly knit urban enclaves, little Italies that sprang up in places like New York's Lower East Side, East Harlem, and just across the river in Newark and other New Jersey cities. These neighborhoods offered familiar language, food, and religious traditions, but they were also marked by overcrowding, poor sanitation, and a constant battle for financial survival. Men worked as laborers, peddlers, or in nearby factories. Women took in boarders or laundry to stretch meager wages. Records place Angelo's adult life firmly in New Jersey, and it is within that state's Italian-American communities that his formative years likely unfolded. Newark in particular had a significant Italian population by the 1910s, especially in its first ward, known for its dense housing and bustling street life. Children in these districts grew up in the shadows of factories and smokestacks, playing in alleys and on stoops, absorbing a mix of old-world customs and new-world pressures. The Catholic Church, local mutual aid societies, and extended family networks formed the backbone of community life, offering support in an environment where mainstream institutions were often indifferent or openly hostile. The hostility took many forms. Newspaper editorials from the period frequently portrayed Italians as inherently criminal or backward. Employers used ethnic stereotypes to justify low wages and unsafe working conditions. Signs that read "No Italians need apply" were not uncommon in certain trades. This climate of prejudice did not predetermine anyone's path, but it did shape the choices available. For many immigrants, the boundaries between legality and illegality could blur in the struggle to get by, whether through unlicensed street vending, informal credit arrangements, or more serious ventures. This was the world in which Angelo passed from boyhood into young adulthood. Very little detailed, reliable information survives about his private life during these early years. There are no diaries, no childhood interviews, and only fragmentary mentions in later investigative files. But the broader pattern of life in his community is well documented. Young men from his background would have been exposed to a spectrum of role models: hard-working laborers who preached patience and thrift, political ward healers who could move mountains of paperwork for a favor, and at the margins, figures who made a living by operating outside the law. Even in these early years, law enforcement paid attention to those margins. Police departments in New York and New Jersey kept informal lists of suspected troublemakers, often targeting entire ethnic groups rather than specific individuals. Italian mutual aid societies and fraternal clubs, which provided insurance and burial funds, were sometimes viewed with suspicion by authorities who could not distinguish between legitimate organizations and those infiltrated by criminal elements. It was in this world of watchful police, tightly bound communities, and fluid morality that the seedbed of organized crime took root. By the time Angelo reached his late teens, the United States itself was changing in ways that would have profound consequences for men of his generation. In 1919, the ratification of the 18th Amendment and the passage of the Volstead Act ushered in national prohibition, making the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages illegal. On paper, these laws represented a moral crusade. In practice, they created a vast underground market almost overnight. Demand for alcohol did not disappear. It simply moved out of the open and into the shadows. For ambitious or desperate individuals in working-class neighborhoods, prohibition presented both temptation and danger. Smuggling liquor, running small stills, or serving as a go-between for larger operations could earn more in a night than legitimate jobs paid in a week. At the same time, competition over territory and supply routes frequently turned violent. Italian, Irish, Jewish, and other ethnic groups all vied for a share of this new illicit economy, especially in urban centers and along key transportation corridors. Newark, situated just across the Hudson from New York City and linked by road and rail to the rest of the Northeast, became an important node in this underground trade. Contemporary police reports and newspaper accounts describe warehouses used as storage depots for smuggled liquor, speedboats crossing from Canadian waters under cover of darkness, and truck convoys moving barrels through industrial districts. The environment in which Angelo came of age was thus one where organized criminal activity was both visible and, in some quarters, normalized as part of the city's unofficial economy. Angelo's precise role in these years is not thoroughly documented, a common problem when reconstructing the lives of early 20th century underworld figures. Formal charges, if they existed, may have been lost, sealed, or never filed at all. What historians and investigative journalists do agree on is that by the mid-20th century, when his name begins appearing more regularly in law enforcement files, He was already regarded as a seasoned participant in criminal enterprises, not a newcomer. That reputation implies a gradual, earlier immersion in illegal activities, even if the specific steps of that progression remain largely hidden from the surviving record. While Prohibition dominated the 1920s, the 1930s brought its own set of pressures. The Great Depression devastated communities like the ones in which Angelo lived. Factories closed or cut wages, unemployment soared. For many families, savings vanished and breadlines became an everyday reality. Under such circumstances, traditional bonds of family and neighborhood became even more crucial. So too, did any means of income, licit or otherwise. Organized crime groups that had grown powerful during Prohibition adapted to the new environment by expanding into gambling, extortion, and control of labor unions. It was during these years that the structure of organized crime in the Northeast began to resemble the more formal hierarchies described in later FBI files. Families, captains, and soldiers, with chains of command and spheres of influence. New York's mafia organizations, eventually known by the names of their leading bosses, extended their reach into New Jersey, often working with or absorbing local gangs. Men like Angelo, rooted in New Jersey's Italian neighborhoods but connected to broader networks, were in a position to act as intermediaries between local operations and larger syndicates centered in New York. The cultural code within which these organizations operated also took firmer hold in this period. Concepts such as loyalty, silence in the face of authorities, and the settling of disputes internally rather than through the courts were not invented by the mafia, but they were woven into its identity. For someone rising within that milieu, a reputation for reliability, discretion, and the ability to manage subordinates and relationships would have been just as important as any personal toughness. Angelo's later life would show that he possessed these attributes, at least in the eyes of those who dealt with him. When he finally appears clearly in accessible government documents, surveillance reports, wiretap transcripts, and court records from the 1950s and 1960s, he is not portrayed as a flamboyant street corner figure, but as a quiet, calculating organizer, someone trusted to oversee lucrative but comparatively low visibility rackets. That trust was not granted lightly. It would have been built over decades of interaction, beginning in the years when Prohibition and the Depression pushed many young men from his background toward choices that law-abiding neighbors might not have made. At the same time, it is important to remember that Angelo's trajectory, while dramatic, was not inevitable. The neighborhoods that produced him also produced teachers, shopkeepers, civil servants, and veterans who built stable, lawful lives. The vast majority of Italian Americans rejected organized crime, even as they were often unfairly tarnished by association in the public imagination. Many community leaders worked actively to combat criminal influence, collaborating with churches, civic organizations, and occasionally law enforcement to steer young people away from the underworld. Yet for those who did enter that world, the rewards could appear immediate and tangible. Cash in hand, deference from neighbors, the sense of belonging to something powerful. The costs, violence, imprisonment, damage to families, and the erosion of trust in the community were real but sometimes less visible in the short term. Angelo's life would exemplify that tension, as he rose in wealth and influence even while becoming the subject of ongoing investigation and, eventually, public prosecution. By the outbreak of the Second World War, the foundations of his later reputation were in place. Italian-American communities in New Jersey had matured, their political clout growing alongside their population. Wartime industries created jobs, and many second-generation immigrants served in the armed forces, staking their claim to full American citizenship on distant battlefields. In the background, however, the structures of organized crime remained intact, adapting to wartime rationing and post-war prosperity alike. Although the documentary record of Angelo's personal life during these years remains thin, the pattern is clear when seen from a distance. He was part of a generation that moved from the old Europe to the industrial cities of the American Northeast, lived through Prohibition and the Depression, and watched as informal neighborhood gangs evolved into components of a national criminal network. The choices he made within that evolving landscape, choices about whom to associate with, how to earn a living, and where to place his loyalty, would eventually turn a boy from an immigrant family into a figure whose name appeared in federal transcripts and presidential files. Decades later, when he walked that courthouse corridor under the glare of television lights, all of this history was packed into the shuffle of his steps. To the casual observer, he was just another defendant in a high-profile criminal case. To those who had followed his story, he represented the accumulated weight of half a century of American social and criminal history, a life shaped by migration, inequality, opportunity, and the shadow economies that grew wherever law and demand failed to align. The frame widens from that courthouse corridor to an earlier Newark, its skyline lower, its streets filled with returning soldiers and factory whistles. It is the mid-1940s. The war is ending, and with it the clear moral lines that had defined the previous 4 years. Men who had fought in Europe and the Pacific come home to neighborhoods that feel both familiar and subtly different. Industrial plants along the Passaic River hum with post-war demand. New housing projects rise on cleared blocks. Flags still hang in tenement windows, but the talk on stoops has shifted from rationing and casualty lists to jobs, wages, and what kind of future this new America will offer. Some of those men return to Newark's First Ward, to Belleville, to the Italian enclaves of North Jersey, where Angelo DeCarlo has quietly moved from being simply another name in the neighborhood to someone more firmly embedded in its underground economy. He is in his 40s now, well past the reckless age of street corner fights and improvised schemes. Those who remember him from earlier years describe a man who favored a low-key presence, solid suits instead of flashy clothes, an unhurried bearing rather than the conspicuous swagger associated with some racketeers of the era. By this point, New Jersey authorities are no longer blind to the existence of organized criminal structures in their state. Internal memoranda from state police and county prosecutors' offices, later reproduced in hearings and journalism, begin to treat syndicate activity in North Jersey as something more organized than scattered local gangs. Names are typed out in lists: suspected bookmakers, enforcers, intermediaries. Among those names, appearing with increasing regularity, is Angelo "Gyp" DeCarlo. The nickname, which would follow him for the rest of his life, was already established by the post-war period. Its origin is uncertain, perhaps a neighborhood tag from youth, perhaps a shortening or distortion of a longer phrase. But by the 1940s, it served as a shorthand identifier in police reports and in the guarded conversations of those who knew how to keep their real business off paper. Law enforcement summaries would refer to him interchangeably as Angelo DeCarlo and Gyp DeCarlo, marking him as part of a loosely defined circle of Italian-American racketeers operating in and around Newark. In these years, the kind of activities linked to him were typical of organized crime in the Northeast: illegal gambling, loan sharking, and the quiet manipulation of certain labor unions and legitimate businesses. Gambling, long a staple of urban vice, took many forms. Numbers games, informal lotteries based on daily betting, circulated in working-class neighborhoods, with runners collecting small wagers from customers who might dream of a sudden windfall. Bookmakers took bets on horse races and sporting events. Card games and dice games operated in back rooms or private clubs. Money flowed in steady streams, and those who controlled the flow controlled a great deal of cash and influence. Loan sharking, the other major line of activity associated with DeCarlo, was more insidious. In an era when many working-class people lacked access to formal bank credit, illegal lenders stepped into the gap, offering quick cash at punishing interest rates. A factory worker behind on mortgage payments, a small shop owner trying to cover payroll, a gambler chasing losses, all might be drawn into such arrangements. The terms were rarely written down in conventional contracts, but they were understood. Mispayments, and you faced mounting interest, the possibility of losing property, and the constant pressure of visits and calls from men who made it their business to ensure that debts were not forgotten. It was within this world of quiet coercion that DeCarlo's reputation grew. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, confidential law enforcement reports frequently linked him to loan sharking operations that extended beyond a single neighborhood. He was described as someone who did not necessarily handle every transaction personally, but who oversaw networks of collectors and intermediaries. The money at stake was substantial. Even a seemingly modest operation, turning over small loans at aggressive interest, could generate steady returns if spread across dozens or hundreds of borrowers. At the same time, organized crime groups in New York were consolidating their own power. What would later be widely known as the Genovese crime family, named after boss Vito Genovese, developed strong interests in New Jersey, often working through established local figures. Newark's underworld landscape in this period cannot be understood without reference to Ruggiero, Richie the Boot, Boiado, a powerful Genovese capo whose base in Essex County gave him influence across North Jersey. Many investigative reports from the 1950s placed DeCarlo within this constellation of power, sometimes as a direct subordinate of more prominent figures, sometimes as a local power in his own right who coordinated with New York leadership when necessary. These organizational charts, drawn up in police stations and FBI offices, were approximations at best, built from informant testimony, surveillance, and fragmentary evidence. But they consistently painted a picture of DeCarlo as part of the New Jersey branch of a larger New York-centered network, a man whose activities were not isolated, but integrated into a broader criminal economy. The post-war economic boom that lifted many American families into relative prosperity also created new opportunities for such men. Construction projects, trucking routes, warehouse operations, and unionized workforces all offered points of leverage. Control over a union local could translate into control over who was hired, how overtime was allocated, which contractors got favorable treatment. Even the rumor that a union or company had protection from figures like DeCarlo could shift the balance of power in negotiations, as employers and workers alike calculated the risks of crossing unseen lines. Most union members, it must be stressed, were ordinary workers with no interest in criminal entanglements. Yet in certain strategic sectors, such as trucking, warehousing, and the waterfront, organized crime figures exploited the complex relationship between unions, employers, and politicians. Testimony in later congressional hearings would describe intimidation of reform-minded union officials, skimming of pension funds, and the imposition of labor-peace agreements that benefited mob-linked employers. In North Jersey, Angelo DeCarlo's name came up in connection with these patterns, particularly in cases involving the use of personal intimidation to settle disputes or collect debts. On the streets where these dynamics played out, his presence was felt more through reputation than through public spectacle. He was not a flamboyant nightclub owner basking in publicity, nor a front-page personality photographed stepping out of limousines. To many residents, he was simply a name whispered with caution, someone you might never see but whom you would be careful not to offend. For small business owners who found themselves in financial trouble, the decision to borrow from people linked to him could feel, at first, like a lifeline. The troubles came later, when payments became unmanageable, and the realization dawned that there was no easy way out. Law enforcement's capacity to confront this kind of embedded criminality was limited in the early post-war years. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under J. Edgar Hoover, publicly downplayed the existence of a national crime syndicate and focused more on bank robbers, espionage, and political surveillance. Local police departments, often underfunded and sometimes compromised by corruption, struggled to gather solid evidence against figures like DeCarlo, who were careful to keep their distance from the most visible aspects of their operations. Arrests did occur. Periodic crackdowns on illegal gambling would sweep up low-level bookmakers and occasionally higher-ranking individuals. Newspaper clippings from the late 1940s and early 1950s mention Angelo DeCarlo in connection with such raids, usually in the context of charges related to gambling or other vice offenses. Convictions, when they came, tended to result in relatively short sentences or fines. The structure of operations, designed to insulate higher-ups, meant that those who organized the loans or oversaw the rackets rarely handled cash directly or delivered threats in person. Their exposure was minimized by layers of intermediaries. The balance began to shift in the early 1950s with the emergence of televised investigations into organized crime. Senator Est's Kefauver's Special Committee to Investigate Crime in Interstate Commerce held hearings around the country, bringing figures from the underworld and from law enforcement into the living rooms of millions of Americans. Viewers saw grainy footage of reluctant witnesses invoking the Fifth Amendment, local officials evading hard questions, and, for the first time, a serious national conversation about the scope of organized crime. Newark was one of the cities examined by the Kefauver Committee, and while Angelo DeCarlo himself did not become a public face in those hearings, the general environment changed around him. The idea of a national syndicate connecting New York, New Jersey, Chicago, and other cities gained broad acceptance. Investigators began to look more closely at the financial and union-related aspects of racketeering, not just at visible vice operations like gambling dens. For men like DeCarlo, this meant more scrutiny on the quiet mechanisms that had once been taken for granted. The steady flow of money through loan books, the relationships with certain union officials, the unspoken understandings with local politicians or police. It also meant adaptation. If law enforcement was going to focus on public gambling locations, the more prudent operators shifted activity further out of sight, into back rooms of seemingly legitimate businesses, into private homes, or onto telephones and coded notes. Loans could be arranged in diners and offices, handed over in envelopes rather than at obvious meeting spots. The game remained the same, but the methods evolved. Within the Italian-American communities where he operated, the response to figures like DeCarlo was complex. Some residents, particularly those who had suffered from his loan sharking, or who resented the climate of fear surrounding certain local unions or businesses, saw him as a destructive force, someone whose presence reinforced negative stereotypes and brought unwanted police attention. Others, especially those who benefited from his financial backing or who sought his help in resolving disputes, viewed him with a mixture of respect and apprehension. Stories circulated of debts quietly forgiven, of troubles with rival gamblers or aggressive creditors resolved after a word in the right ear. These accounts, which later fed into more romanticized portrayals in popular culture, rarely mentioned the broader pattern of exploitation that underpinned his power. As the 1950s progressed, the national structure of organized crime continued to crystallize. Meetings among high-level bosses attempted to coordinate territories and avoid open conflicts that might invite law enforcement crackdowns. Although Angelo DeCarlo's name does not appear among the roster of top national leaders, his suspected position as a capo or senior figure in the Genovese family's New Jersey operations put him in the orbit of these larger strategic decisions. When New York bosses decided to emphasize certain rackets over others, or when conflicts arose over overlapping interests, local figures like DeCarlo were the ones who had to implement policy on the ground. One of the most significant turning points in the public understanding of organized crime came in 1957, with the Appalachian meeting in upstate New York. Dozens of reputed mob leaders from across the country were detained after state police disrupted a gathering at the home of Joseph Barbara, a local businessman and suspected crime figure. Photographs of well-dressed men trudging through the woods or sitting in state police barracks ran in newspapers nationwide. The event made it impossible for federal authorities to maintain that talk of a national criminal organization was the stuff of tabloid exaggeration. In the wake of Appalachian, the FBI formally acknowledged the existence of a structured organization it called La Cosa Nostra. Systematic programs of surveillance and intelligence gathering were launched. Files were reorganized. Informants were cultivated with renewed vigor. In New Jersey, the names of those believed to be part of the Genovese family's local network, among them, repeatedly, Angelo DeCarlo, were now recorded in federal as well as state indexes. Wiretapping and electronic surveillance, still in their relatively early stages, began to play a larger role. Court-authorized listening devices placed in social clubs, restaurants, and union offices captured fragments of conversations, coded references to debts, oblique mentions of business, careful hints at relationships between underworld figures and ostensibly legitimate enterprises. Much of this material could not yet be used directly in court, due to evolving legal standards on evidence, but it provided investigators with maps of relationships and hierarchies. These maps almost always placed DeCarlo in a managerial position rather than at the front lines. He was described in internal reports as an overseer or controller of loan sharking and gambling operations, someone whose name surfaced when disputes arose that smaller players could not resolve on their own. This role required a particular blend of qualities: enough authority to command obedience, enough caution to avoid unnecessary exposure, and enough skill at negotiation to keep profits flowing without erupting into open conflict that might attract press and police. The human cost of these operations, however, did not always remain hidden. Court documents and later journalistic investigations contained testimonies from borrowers who had fallen behind on high interest payments. They described lives constricted by constant fear, the fear of losing homes, of family members being confronted, of never escaping a debt that grew faster than they could pay it down. Some spoke of being pressured into signing over businesses, of being told which suppliers to use or which contractors to hire, tying them ever more tightly into the web of control. Gambling, too, left scars that went beyond the ledgers. The post-war years saw a rise in disposable income for many working-class families, and with it a greater capacity for recreational betting. For some, playing the numbers or placing small bets on sports remained a form of entertainment, a harmless diversion. For others, the craving for a big win led to lost wages, strained marriages, and ultimately the need to borrow from the very people who profited from their losses. In this cycle of risk and dependency, Angelo DeCarlo's operations occupied a central, if often unseen, place in parts of North Jersey. Yet he also cultivated, whether consciously or not, a more nuanced image in some quarters. He frequented restaurants and clubs where musicians performed, part of the lively entertainment scene that blossomed in New Jersey and New York in the 1950s. Singers and bandleaders looking to make a living in these venues often encountered underworld figures who controlled bookings, loaned money for equipment, or offered to help with contractual disputes. Decades later, when stories emerged of DeCarlo's associations with certain performers, they reflected this intersection of entertainment, business, and the shadow economy that surrounded nightclubs and music halls. By the end of the 1950s, the outlines of his life were set in sharper relief. From a childhood shaped by migration and poverty, he had risen within the subterranean hierarchy of North Jersey's criminal world to a position of significant influence. Law enforcement now regarded him not as a small-time gambler, but as a key figure in loan sharking and related rackets, connected to one of the most powerful mafia families in the United States. His activities touched the lives of debtors, gamblers, union members, and business owners, often in ways they could not safely discuss publicly. At the same time, the tools arrayed against him were improving. Federal investigators, armed with new legal authorities and more sophisticated surveillance techniques, were beginning to assemble a body of evidence not just about individual incidents, but about patterns of conduct stretching over years. Angelo DeCarlo, who had spent decades operating in the space between neighborhood rumor and official neglect, was moving inexorably into the center of a story that would soon be told in courtrooms, headlines, and, eventually, presidential archives. The era in which he could count on anonymity, however carefully cultivated, was coming to an end. By the early 1960s, the country that had once seemed content to treat organized crime as a local embarrassment was beginning to stare it in the face. Televised committee hearings, sensational books, and a new generation of federal prosecutors were chipping away at the old myth that mobsters were simply colorful neighborhood figures. In Washington, the Kennedy administration spoke openly of a war on organized crime. In field offices across the Northeast, the FBI quietly rolled out something even more concrete. Lists of top hoodlums in each major city, men to be watched relentlessly, their movements logged, their associates cataloged. In Newark and the surrounding towns of North Jersey, Angelo "Gyp" DeCarlo's name appeared near the top of those internal lists. He was no longer a young operator trying to prove himself. Now in his late 50s, DeCarlo had accumulated decades of experience in gambling, loan sharking, and the management of underlings who handled the rougher edges of that work. Investigative files from the period describe him not as a street corner bookmaker, but as a controller of several such men, someone whose decisions could affect the finances of dozens of smaller players and hundreds of debtors. The tools being used against him were changing. Where earlier police attention had consisted largely of sporadic raids and the occasional arrest on gambling charges, federal authorities in the 1960s were developing more systematic strategies. The Justice Department's newly energized organized crime and racketeering section established strike forces in selected cities, combining prosecutors, FBI agents, and agents from other federal services into coordinated teams. Newark Strike Force, formally launched a bit later in the decade, built on groundwork already being laid by FBI squads who had been watching DeCarlo and his associates for years. Their working picture of his world was detailed, if incomplete. Surveillance reports described regular routines, mornings spent in certain diners or social clubs, afternoons slipping between nondescript offices and apartment buildings, evenings at restaurants or private back rooms. The locations were carefully chosen, places where he could blend in among businessmen, union officials, and neighborhood figures, places where loyalty and silence were expected. The structure of the organization around him had also come into sharper focus. By now, law enforcement widely accepted that what they called the Genovese crime family exercised authority over much of the Italian-American underworld in North Jersey. Ruggiero Richie the Boot Boiado, operating from his base in Essex County, was regarded as the most visible embodiment of that. Power, a seasoned capo who had built his influence during Prohibition and the Depression. Within that framework, DeCarlo was increasingly identified as a key figure, an important subordinate whose role centered on loan sharking, gambling, and related rackets. Exactly when he attained the rank investigators would later call capo is hard to pin down with precision. The underworld left few official promotion notices, but by the early 1960s, confidential informants were reporting that he had authority to direct crews in New Jersey, to approve certain ventures, and to settle disputes among lower-level associates. In the cautious, hierarchical world of organized crime, such authority was not granted lightly. At the same time, the public's understanding of that world was being transformed by a man who had nothing to do with DeCarlo personally, but whose words reshaped the entire investigative landscape: Joseph Valachi. A low-level member of the Genovese family, Valachi broke the ancient code of silence in 1962 while serving a federal prison sentence. A year later, in widely publicized testimony before a Senate subcommittee, he laid out in plain terms the existence of a nationwide criminal organization, explaining its initiation rituals, ranks, and methods. Valachi did not make DeCarlo into a household name. His testimony focused on bosses and long-term associates he had known in New York. But for agents and prosecutors already tracking New Jersey figures, his descriptions of structure and procedure were a revelation. Behaviors that had once seemed like isolated quirks now fit into a recognizable pattern. The notion of a family with bosses, capos, and soldiers, each with defined responsibilities and obligations, gave investigators a framework for placing men like DeCarlo within an intelligible hierarchy. Armed with this conceptual map, federal and state authorities re-examined their files. Telephone toll records, surveillance notes, and informant reports that had accumulated over years were reviewed with fresh eyes. Names that appeared again and again in connection with gambling and loan sharking. Names like Angelo DeCarlo took on greater significance. The fact that he was frequently seen in the company of known Genovese associates, that he appeared at events where influential underworld figures gathered, that his presence seemed to settle arguments among local operators. These details reinforced the emerging conclusion that he was more than simply a neighborhood loan shark. At street level, the business model that sustained his power remained relatively straightforward. Illegal gambling continued to be a basic revenue stream. The numbers game thrived in working-class districts of Newark, Elizabeth, and nearby towns, as did sports betting and card games. Law enforcement records suggest that DeCarlo's operations did not rely on a single large gambling establishment vulnerable to a dramatic raid. Rather, they consisted of many smaller mobile setups, back rooms in bars, tables in social clubs, gatherings in private homes, each of which could be shut down and moved if scrutiny became too intense. Loan sharking, however, was increasingly central to his reputation. The practice had evolved in response to changing economic conditions. As banks and legitimate lenders slowly expanded their services in the post-war era, the most obvious niches for illegal credit shifted. Rather than simply serving as lenders of last resort for workers behind on rent, high-interest outfits like those associated with DeCarlo aimed at people engaged in riskier forms of speculation. Small business owners seeking quick capital, independent gamblers needing to cover large bets, middlemen in various gray market trades. The mechanics were simple enough. Money was advanced on short terms, often weekly, at interest rates far beyond what any bank could legally charge. Borrowers knew or quickly learned that the lender was not someone to disappoint. If they fell behind, interest could be compounded, collateral demanded, partnerships imposed. Investigative transcripts and later courtroom testimony make clear that while the ultimate enforcement of these agreements rested on the implicit threat of violence, the day-to-day reality involved a more constant, grinding form of pressure. Unannounced visits, phone calls at inconvenient hours, the subtle but unmistakable message that there was no safe way to walk away from the debt. In such an environment, information became a weapon. Those running the loan sharking operations needed to know which borrowers had assets to seize, which had relatives who could be pressured, which might be considering reporting their situation to the authorities. The FBI, seeking to penetrate this closed world, likewise depended on information, from electronic surveillance where it could be lawfully obtained, and from human sources willing to talk in exchange for leniency or protection. Cultivating such sources around DeCarlo was not easy. His reputation for caution and for rewarding loyalty was well earned. Men who worked under him had steady incomes and, in some cases, a sense that they were part of a disciplined, if illicit, enterprise. Yet the same economic and social forces that had drawn them into his orbit debt, fear, ambition, could also pull them out again when law enforcement offered an alternative. By the early 1960s, federal agents in New Jersey had begun to develop precisely the kind of cooperative witnesses they needed. Some were small-time bookmakers caught in routine raids. Others were borrowers who had reached the end of their resources and saw no other escape from their obligations. When these individuals recounted how their debts had escalated, whose names were invoked during threatening conversations, and who was said to be behind the collectors, Angelo DeCarlo's name surfaced repeatedly. Still, building a criminal case against a man at his level required more than hearsay. Prosecutors needed evidence that could withstand cross-examination, documentation, and recordings that showed not only his association with known criminals, but his active direction of specific illegal acts. Legal tools for gathering such evidence were themselves evolving. Congress passed the Travel Act in 1961, targeting those who used interstate facilities to carry on gambling or extortion. The Federal Wire Act of the same year was aimed at bookmakers who took bets across state lines by telephone or telegraph. These statutes, combined with court-approved wiretaps and microphone installations under new legal standards, opened avenues for federal intervention into what had previously been considered largely local matters. For DeCarlo, whose operations and connections often straddled the fluid border between New York and New Jersey, this shift was significant. Calls placed from Newark social clubs to Manhattan offices, or from New Jersey restaurants to Florida and California, now carried more legal risk. Travel by associates to collect debts or manage gambling operations in neighboring states could bring federal investigators into the picture. Even if he rarely left his home territory, the network he helped oversee was increasingly crisscrossed by wires and highways that fell squarely within federal jurisdiction. While law enforcement was tightening its net, the social and economic environment of North Jersey was changing in ways that complicated the picture. Newark, once a thriving industrial and commercial hub, was entering a period of urban decline marked by factory closures, racial tension, and political unrest. Many white ethnics, including large numbers of Italian Americans, began moving to suburban towns, even as African American and Puerto Rican residents, often excluded from those same suburbs, concentrated in the older city neighborhoods. This transformation did not take place overnight, nor did it eliminate the influence of figures like DeCarlo. On the contrary, his operations adapted. Loan sharking and gambling clientele followed their operators into the suburbs, operating in basements, private homes, and small businesses that seemed respectable from the outside. At the same time, long-standing ties to unions, trucking firms, and construction companies ensured that his interests in the city did not evaporate. The Underworld intersected with legitimate institutions in particularly visible ways through labor. In nearby Union City and across the Hudson on the New York waterfront, investigations exposed extensive mob control of dockworkers' unions. In northern New Jersey, Teamsters locals, most famously the one dominated by Anthony "Tony Pro" Provenzano, became synonymous with racketeering and intimidation. While Provenzano operated within the same broader Genovese orbit as DeCarlo, their spheres of influence were not identical. Nonetheless, FBI and Labor Department records often mention their names in the same context, as part of a pattern of organized criminal exploitation of union power in the region. Within this landscape, DeCarlo's contribution lay less in public union leadership and more in the provision of capital and enforcement. When union officials or contractors needed quick, off-the-books funds, whether to pay off restive members, finance side deals, or simply line their own pockets, Underworld loans filled the gap. Those loans were rarely made out of charity. Testimony from multiple later proceedings indicates that organized crime figures used such loans to secure influence over key decisions, which companies received contracts, which workers were assigned to the best jobs, which reform-minded officials were quietly edged out or threatened into silence. Beyond the world of factories and freight yards, DeCarlo's name surfaced, sometimes firmly, sometimes more hazily, in the nightlife and entertainment circuits of New Jersey. Clubs and lounges in Newark, Belleville, and neighboring towns offered steady work for singers and musicians in the early 1960s, just as new styles of popular music were emerging. Many of these venues were, in practice, controlled or heavily influenced by organized crime figures. They provided ideal fronts for gambling, money laundering, and the quiet settlement of underworld disputes, all while projecting a glamorous image to the paying public. Decades later, memoirs and interviews by some New Jersey entertainers suggested that Angelo DeCarlo took a personal interest in certain performers, extending loans, smoothing over disputes, or offering informal protection when club owners balked at promised payments. These recollections, some of them filtered through the lens of nostalgia and popular dramatizations, are difficult to verify in detail. Historians generally agree, however, that he was a familiar presence in this milieu, and that his role illustrates the broader pattern of organized crime entanglement with the entertainment industry. Part benefactor, part exploiter, always operating from a position of power that rested on fear as much as on patronage. As the mid-1960s approached, the cumulative effect of these intertwined activities was to make DeCarlo a figure of intense interest to multiple branches of government. The FBI watched him as a key Genovese capo in New Jersey. The Justice Department's labor racketeering specialist flagged him as someone whose loans and influence likely touched union affairs. Local prosecutors, aware of his reputation but often lacking the resources to tackle him directly, shared information with federal colleagues. His name appeared in internal reports, inter-office memoranda, and on the cover sheets of investigative files that grew thicker each year. Yet in public, he remained comparatively obscure. Unlike some flamboyant bosses who earned front-page headlines, Angelo DeCarlo's presence in newspapers during the early 1960s was sporadic and often confined to brief items about gambling crackdowns or vague references in broader articles on organized crime. When he did appear by name, he was usually described in cautious terms: alleged rackets figure, suspected gambling boss, reflecting both libel concerns and the fact that, up to that point, he had avoided convictions on the most serious charges his adversaries believed they could one day prove. Behind the scenes, however, pressure was mounting. Federal investigators were learning from earlier frustrations. Cases built purely on eyewitness testimony from frightened debtors were easily undermined by defense attorneys. Raids on small-time gambling operations produced impressive-looking stacks of seized betting slips but rarely touched the higher-ups. The new generation of prosecutors sought something different: wiretap evidence, recorded conversations, financial records tying cash flows to specific acts of extortion, and testimony from insiders high enough in the organization to link DeCarlo directly to decisions about violence and coercion. Collecting such evidence took time and patience. Court orders had to be obtained, equipment installed and maintained, chains of custody established. Agents spent long hours listening to muffled conversations on scratchy lines, trying to separate casual talk from incriminating admissions. Informants needed to be protected, not only physically, but in their credibility, against efforts by defense lawyers to paint them as unreliable or vindictive. For years, it seemed as though DeCarlo's caution might keep him just out of reach. He did not, according to investigative summaries, indulge in careless boasting over the phone. He surrounded himself with buffers who could absorb blame if low-level operations were exposed, and the code of silence remained remarkably strong among many of his closest associates. Still, the wider currents were turning against him. Congressional concern over loan sharking and its impact on interstate commerce was growing. Business owners gave quiet, off-the-record accounts of being trapped in cycles of debt to men whose power reached far beyond any single neighborhood. Lawmakers, reading such reports and hearing from law enforcement, began to explore more targeted legislation aimed specifically at extortionate credit practices. By the mid-1960s, therefore, the arc of Angelo DeCarlo's life had reached a precarious balance. On one side were the fruits of decades spent building an underworld career, wealth, deference, and a position of authority within one of the country's most formidable criminal organizations. On the other were the increasingly sophisticated efforts of a government that had finally, if belatedly, committed itself to confronting figures like him, not just as local troublemakers, but as components of a national problem. He moved through this tightening landscape with the same measured gait that would later be captured in courthouse footage. Cautious, deliberate, apparently unconcerned. But the intricate web of loans, favors, threats, and alliances that sustained his power was becoming more visible to those who had dedicated their careers to unraveling it. The next few years would determine whether that visibility could be translated into the one thing law enforcement had so far lacked: a comprehensive, prosecutable case that could finally pull Angelo DeCarlo out of the shadows and into the bright, unforgiving light of a federal courtroom. In the middle years of the 1960s, the world around Angelo DeCarlo was shifting in ways that would prove decisive, even if, at first, the changes were mostly felt far from the Newark streets he knew so well. In Washington, D.C., policymakers and prosecutors were trying to translate years of hearings and reports into tools that could reach deeper into the operations of men like him. They had listened to business people and gamblers describe how a single bad month could entangle them with illegal lenders for years. They had read thick investigative files from New York, Chicago, and North Jersey outlining the same pattern over and over. A man in trouble, a loan made on terms no bank would offer, and then a steady drumbeat of pressure until the borrower surrendered property, influence, or peace of mind. For years, this had been understood as an ugly but local problem, something police and prosecutors handled case by case. By the mid-1960s, that view was changing. President Lyndon Johnson's administration commissioned wide-ranging studies on crime in America. One of the resulting reports, focused on organized crime, concluded that extortionate credit and related rackets were not isolated abuses, but part of a nationwide system that exploited weaknesses in the legitimate financial world. Testimony from New Jersey, where investigators had long tracked loan operations tied to DeCarlo and his associates, played into this new understanding. The problem, as federal officials saw it, was that existing laws were badly suited to the reality of loan sharking. Victims were often too frightened to testify fully. Threats were seldom delivered in explicit terms. A raised eyebrow, a remark about what had happened to someone else, or the mere reputation of the lender could be enough to send the message. When borrowers did come forward, defense attorneys could pick apart their accounts as exaggerations or misunderstandings. Prosecutors needed a framework that reflected the way these transactions actually worked. In 1968, Congress responded with a new piece of legislation, the Consumer Credit Protection Act. Buried within its broader provisions on fair lending practices was a section tailored to the world in which DeCarlo operated, Title II, dealing with extortionate credit transactions. For the first time under federal law, courts were authorized to treat loans carrying extremely high interest rates, extended by people known in the community for using intimidation, as evidence of criminal activity in and of themselves. Prosecutors no longer had to produce a tape of a lender explicitly threatening harm. They could ask juries to infer coercion from the combination of usurious terms and the lender's reputation. The law also created specific federal crimes, making an extortionate extension of credit, collecting or attempting to collect such a debt, and financing those who did so. These provisions were written with the understanding that those at the top of the underworld's financial hierarchy rarely knocked on doors themselves. They bankrolled others, provided capital, and expected to be repaid from the proceeds of whatever means those underlings used to collect. For investigators in Newark and across New Jersey, who had spent years watching Angelo DeCarlo occupy precisely that kind of role, Title II felt like a statute written with men like him in mind. Almost simultaneously, another law changed the rules of the game. The Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, specifically its Title III, put federal wiretapping and electronic surveillance on a clearer legal footing. After years of controversy over covert listening devices, the act established procedures for prosecutors to obtain court orders authorizing wiretaps and bugs, along with safeguards intended to protect the rights of those not involved in crime. For organized crime investigations, including those focused on DeCarlo, this meant that recordings that might once have been of dubious admissibility could now be solid evidence if gathered under the new standards. These developments in Washington did not instantly alter daily life in North Jersey, but over time their effects began to show in the rhythms of DeCarlo's world. He was now in his early 60s, part of an older generation of racketeers whose careers stretched back to Prohibition. The young men who worked under him had grown up in a different America, one shaped by television, suburbanization, and, increasingly, social unrest. Yet the basic structures of the underworld around Newark remained recognizable, loosely defined crews of gamblers and enforcers, coordinated by men like DeCarlo, who had the backing of the Genovese family and the authority to settle disputes. The city itself, though, was becoming less familiar. On hot July days in 1967, long simmering tensions over policing, housing, and discrimination erupted into what would be remembered as the Newark riots. For several days, large parts of the city were engulfed in protest and chaos. Buildings burned, storefronts were smashed, and clashes between residents and law enforcement left deep scars. Many Italian-American families, who had already begun moving to nearby suburbs, accelerated their departure. Businesses that had anchored neighborhood life for decades closed or relocated. Organized crime figures, including those associated with the Genovese family, adjusted their operations to this new reality. With traditional Italian neighborhoods in Newark shrinking and changing, social clubs and meeting places shifted further into suburban towns, even as old ties within the city persisted through remaining businesses, trucking routes, and unions. For an operator like DeCarlo, who had always preferred back rooms and side streets to public limelight, the move outward to less conspicuous settings came naturally. Federal agents noted these shifts in their reports. Surveillance logs from the late 1960s show less time spent watching certain Newark corners and more time staked out near restaurants and lounges in adjoining communities. Cars associated with DeCarlo were observed pulling into parking lots miles from the old First Ward, sometimes late at night, sometimes midday, always for meetings that were short on outward drama but, investigators suspected, rich in content. What those meetings contained was, increasingly, a matter not of guesswork but of recorded sound. Applying under the new Title III procedures, federal prosecutors secured court orders to place listening devices in selected locations tied to Genovese-connected activity in New Jersey. One such spot was a social club that DeCarlo frequented, a modest establishment that drew a steady mix of gamblers, small businessmen, and known underworld figures. Another was a telephone line used by one of his close associates, a man suspected of handling day-to-day gambling and loan collections. The recordings that resulted were often murky. Dishes clattered in the background, jukeboxes blared, conversations overlapped. Agents assigned to transcribe tapes spent hours replaying the same few minutes, straining to distinguish one voice from another. But over weeks and months, patterns emerged. Men discussed debts, mentioned interest rates that would have made a bank officer blanch, and described borrowers who were getting nervous. There were oblique references to sending a message, to taking care of someone who had become a problem. In some fragments, DeCarlo's voice could be heard clearly enough, identified by agents who had spent years tailing him, and in some cases, by cooperating witnesses who knew him personally. He did not rant or boast. If anything, what struck listeners later was the ordinary tone in which he addressed extraordinary matters, the calm evaluation of how much pressure a debtor could bear, the matter-of-fact references to associates who might be brought in to straighten out a situation. Parallel to the surveillance effort, investigators continued to cultivate human sources. The new loan sharking statutes offered potential leverage. A borrower who had taken illegal credit could, in theory, face prosecution as well, though in practice charges were more often held in reserve as a pressure tactic. Federal agents could approach someone in hock to DeCarlo's operation and lay out the stakes. Continued silence might mean not only worsening debt and informal threats, but also potential legal exposure. Cooperation could lead to protection, relocation, and a fresh start. Some said no. Others, weighed down by years of fear and financial ruin, agreed to talk. Their statements fleshed out the dry outlines of what agents heard on tapes. A shop owner might describe how an initial loan, presented almost as a favor, had carried a weekly service fee that quickly rivaled the principal. A gambler might recount how missed payments led to nighttime visits from men who spoke softly, but left no doubt about the consequences of default. Again and again, when these witnesses described who ultimately controlled the money, who set the terms and reaped the profits, the name Gyp surfaced. Among the most valuable of these witnesses were not only borrowers, but also lower-level collectors and bookmakers who had fallen afoul of the law for their own activities. Facing possible prison terms and the hostility of their former bosses, some decided that their best chance lay in cooperating. From them, prosecutors learned how cash moved up the chain, how a collector might keep a cut, pass the rest to a middleman, who then delivered envelopes or bundles to a higher-ranking figure. In many of these accounts, the path led, sooner or later, to Angelo DeCarlo. By late 1968, federal prosecutors in Newark believed they had the makings of a major case. The new extortionate credit statutes provided the legal framework. Wiretaps and room bugs supplied recorded conversation. Borrowers and former associates offered testimony that could help explain the jargon and half-spoken phrases on the tapes. Internal memoranda circulated within the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Justice Department's Organized Crime Section, outlining a proposed prosecution that would target DeCarlo not for a single isolated act, but for his role in financing and directing an ongoing loan sharking enterprise. Then, as they sifted through the body of evidence, investigators confronted a darker thread in the material they had gathered. Discussions about dealing with someone perceived as a threat to the operation, not merely through intimidation, but by eliminating him entirely. The man in question, whose identity was shielded in early reports and court filings, was someone on the margins of DeCarlo's world, a gambler or small-time associate who, according to informants, had been talking too freely, perhaps to rivals, perhaps to law enforcement. On certain recordings, voices associated by agents with DeCarlo and two of his close associates could be heard talking about this individual with growing concern. They discussed his habit of visiting law enforcement offices, his nervous behavior, his mounting debts. The conversations moved from irritation to something more ominous, talk of finding a guy to take care of it, of arranging for the man to be hit if he did not change his behavior. Prosecutors understood the gravity of what they were hearing. To bring such evidence into court would mean not only charging DeCarlo under the extortionate credit statutes, but also accusing him of conspiring to arrange a killing, a charge that, even if it remained at the level of conspiracy rather than an accomplished act, would underscore the extent to which violence or the threat of it was woven into the fabric of his financial empire. It would also require extraordinary care. Courts were still feeling their way through the admissibility of electronic surveillance, and any misstep in how the recordings were obtained or presented could jeopardize the entire prosecution. Throughout 1968 and into early 1969, grand juries in Newark heard from the assembled witnesses. Borrowers described their debts and the fear that surrounded them. Former associates explained who answered to whom, how meetings were arranged, what certain coded phrases meant. Agents and technicians testified about the placement of wiretaps and microphones, the chain of custody for tape recordings, and the painstaking process by which voices were identified and conversations transcribed. Behind closed doors, the picture that had occupied the private notebooks of investigators for years was finally being translated into sworn testimony. A structured loan sharking network operating under Genovan's family protection in North Jersey, with Angelo DeCarlo at or near the top of its local hierarchy, and with a willingness to contemplate extreme measures when the network's secrecy or profits seemed at risk. In the spring of 1969, the process moved from secrecy to public action. A federal grand jury in Newark returned an indictment charging DeCarlo and several associates under the new extortionate credit provisions. The indictment alleged that they had made and collected illegal loans, used implicit threats and reputational pressure to enforce repayment, and financed others who did the same. In an additional count, it charged that DeCarlo and two co-defendants had conspired to arrange the killing of a man they believed posed a danger to their operations. For most Americans, the filing of an indictment is an abstract event, a line in the newspaper. For those who had spent years keeping their distance from figures like DeCarlo out of fear, it was something more, a sign, however tentative, that the state was prepared to take on a man widely regarded as untouchable. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. There were no chases through back alleys, no cinematic standoffs. When federal agents arrived with a warrant, DeCarlo submitted calmly, accompanied by his attorney. Cameras captured him being led into the federal building in Newark, dressed in a conservative suit, flanked by marshals. Seen without context, he might have been just another businessman summoned to answer questions. Only the clusters of reporters and the careful phrasing of the charges hinted at the weight of the case. At his arraignment, held in a packed federal courtroom, DeCarlo stood as the clerk read out the counts. Through his lawyer, he entered pleas of not guilty to all charges. The defense team, composed of experienced attorneys familiar with the complexities of organized crime cases, wasted no time in signaling their strategy. They questioned the legality of the electronic surveillance, probed for weaknesses in the government's handling of informants, and suggested that witnesses were exaggerating or inventing stories in hopes of leniency. Outside the courthouse, microphones were thrust toward prosecutors, defense lawyers, and anyone else willing to speak. Officials from the U.S. Attorney's Office emphasized that the case represented a new phase in the federal assault on loan sharking, made possible by the laws Congress had recently passed. They carefully avoided prejudging the outcome, but their message was clear. The government was no longer content to pursue only the lowest-level bookmakers. It was going after those who financed and orchestrated the trade. For the press, the indictment provided an opportunity to introduce readers to a figure whose name had long circulated in police circles, but had rarely appeared in headlines. Articles described Angelo DeCarlo as an alleged mafia leader, or reputed loan shark boss, tracing his supposed rise from the back rooms of Newark to a position of influence in the Genovese family's New Jersey operations. Some pieces linked his case to broader discussions of organized crime, noting that he had allegedly functioned as a kind of banker for illegal ventures, and that his arrest was seen within law enforcement as a significant step. Within the Italian-American communities where he had made his name, reactions were mixed. Some quietly expressed satisfaction that a man they associated with fear and exploitation was finally facing serious charges. Others, wary of attracting attention or reluctant to see any neighbor, even a powerful and intimidating one, handed over to federal authorities, kept their opinions to themselves. A few voiced skepticism, framing the indictment as part of a broader pattern of discrimination that lumped ordinary Italian Americans together with a small criminal minority. For DeCarlo himself, the months following the indictment were consumed by the grind of pretrial proceedings. His attorneys filed motions to suppress the wiretap and microphone evidence, arguing that the surveillance authorizations had been improperly obtained or executed. They challenged the sufficiency of the indictment, the reliability of informant testimony, and the fairness of trying both the loan sharking and the alleged murder conspiracy in a single case. Prosecutors responded with detailed affidavits, listing dates, judges' orders, and technical procedures to show that they had followed the new laws governing surveillance to the letter. Meanwhile, the practical realities of being under federal indictment took their toll. Bail conditions limited DeCarlo's movements and contacts. Associates who once visited openly grew more cautious, aware that any conversation might be watched or recorded. Some distanced themselves entirely, unsure whether their names might surface next in a grand jury room. Others closed ranks, seeing in the case not just a legal threat but a test of loyalty. In the summer and autumn of 1969, as pretrial hearings unfolded, the contrast between the public and private faces of the man at the center of it all became stark. In the courtroom, Angelo "Gyp" DeCarlo appeared as a courteous, almost grandfatherly figure, quietly conferring with his lawyers, occasionally looking over at reporters with an inscrutable expression. In the government's filings and summaries of intercepted conversations, he was portrayed as the calculating handler of illegal loans, a man whose calm discussions of money and discipline had, according to prosecutors, extended to planning the ultimate sanction against someone viewed as a liability. By the time a trial date was finally set, the stakes for both sides could not have been clearer. For the federal government, a conviction would validate not only years of investigative work, but also the new legal framework it had urged Congress to create. It would send a message to other underworld figures who had long considered loan sharking a comparatively low-risk, high-profit enterprise. For Angelo DeCarlo, the case represented the most serious challenge he had faced in a career spent navigating the margins between wealth and prison, influence and exposure. The era in which he could operate behind a shield of rumor and local reputation was over. The next step would take place not in back rooms, but under the bright lights of a federal courtroom, before a jury asked to decide whether the man known as Gyp had in fact built his life on fear, exploitation, and the implicit promise of violence. The trial opened in a packed federal courtroom in Newark at the turn of the decade, in an atmosphere that reflected both the changing legal landscape and the long, quiet reach of Angelo "Gyp" DeCarlo's career. Reporters from local papers, wire services, and a few national outlets squeezed into the wooden benches, alongside curious members of the public and men in dark suits whose connections were never spelled out in print. At the defense table sat DeCarlo, now in his late 60s, his hair thinning, his posture still erect. To those who had spent years reading his name in confidential memoranda, seeing him under fluorescent lights and a judge's gaze was a remarkable shift. The indictment that brought him there had several layers, but two themes dominated. First were the extortionate credit charges, that DeCarlo had financed and overseen a loan sharking operation that extended cash at ruinous interest rates to borrowers in northern New Jersey, using fear, rooted in his reputation and that of his associates, to enforce payment. Second was the allegation that, when a man on the fringe of that world was perceived as a threat, DeCarlo and two co-defendants had conspired to arrange his murder. The government emphasized that the conspiracy charge did not depend on a killing actually being carried out. It rested on evidence that serious steps had been taken toward that end. Federal prosecutors, operating under the leadership of U.S. Attorney Frederick Lacy, framed the case as a test of the new legal tools Congress had placed in their hands. In their opening statements, they told the jury that they would not ask for a verdict based on rumor or on the mere fact that DeCarlo's name inspired fear. Instead, they promised to present recordings, financial evidence, and the testimony of those who had seen his operation from the inside, victims and former underlings alike. The recording devices that had captured some of the key conversations were at the heart of the government's case. Agents described in restrained, technical language how they had applied to federal judges for authorization under Title III of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, how the orders had been granted for limited periods, how microphones had been installed in specific locations tied to suspected criminal activity, and how telephone lines had been tapped. Defense attorneys listened closely, searching for any hint that an agent had cut a procedural corner that might later serve as grounds to throw out the evidence. When the tapes were played for the jury, they carried the muffled, indistinct sound that had become familiar to the investigators who had first heard them in cramped listening rooms. Jurors leaned forward to catch words as the hum of background noise, clinking glasses, and other voices washed over the main conversation. Prosecutors had transcripts ready, but the judge reminded the panel that it was the recordings themselves, not the typed interpretations, that were the actual evidence. On some of those tapes, the government argued, the jury was listening to Angelo DeCarlo in his own voice. Agents and cooperating witnesses identified him based on years of surveillance and personal familiarity. The man speaking did not sound like the snarling caricature of a gangster from movies. Instead, he sounded like a quiet, older businessman discussing accounts. He spoke of loans, of cash out on the street, of borrowers who were late or dodging. On certain key recordings, he and two associates could be heard discussing a man described as troublesome, someone, the government maintained, they believed might talk to authorities. The phrases used were oblique, but prosecutors argued that in context, the meaning was unmistakable. They were talking about having the man hit, about taking care of the problem permanently. Without context, such words might have seemed ambiguous. To fill in that context, prosecutors called borrowers and former associates to the stand. The first category included small business owners and gamblers who described how an initial loan, offered in some cases, when they were desperate to cover payroll or salvage a failing venture, had quickly become a heavy burden. They testified about interest rates far exceeding anything allowed in legitimate finance, about payments that covered only the interest, never the principal, and about the consequences when they struggled to keep up. Their accounts were not filled with lurid detail. The government did not need theatrics. What emerged was a pattern of steady pressure, weekly visits from collectors who arrived unannounced, reminders that the man behind this money was not someone to cross, mention of what had happened to others who had failed to pay. When asked directly whether DeCarlo had personally threatened them, some witnesses said no, that they had rarely or never seen him face to face. But they were clear about whose name was invoked when they hesitated to hand over cash. More damaging from the defense's standpoint were the testimonies of former insiders, lower-level collectors and bookmakers who had been caught in other cases and who now cooperated in exchange for reduced sentences or placement in witness protection. One after another, they described an organizational structure that matched, in broad outline, what the FBI and other agencies had long suspected. There were men who ran daily operations, collecting payments and placing bets. Above them were figures who handled the money in larger chunks, settled disputes, and reported to Jip or to his closest lieutenants. Cash, they said, flowed upward in envelopes and paper bags, sometimes delivered in person, sometimes handed off through intermediaries. Under questioning, these witnesses explained terms that might otherwise have slipped past jurors. When a collector told a debtor that the old man was getting impatient, they said, he was referring to DeCarlo. When someone spoke of needing to get okay from Jip before adjusting a payment schedule or forgiving a portion of a loan, that meant that decisions about money, and crucially about how hard to press someone, ultimately rested with him. On the alleged murder conspiracy, the insider's accounts and the tapes intersected in particularly stark ways. One former associate, testifying under an agreement with prosecutors, told the jury that conversations about the troublesome man had progressed from complaints about his behavior to discussion of putting out word that a contract was available. Another described being approached by an intermediary and asked if he knew anybody who could do a piece of work, language that, in that milieu, he said was understood to mean a killing. Both men testified that the plan was never carried out, but that the seriousness of the talk left no doubt in their minds about the intent. Defense attorneys attacked these accounts aggressively on cross-examination. They pointed out that the cooperating witnesses were admitted criminals, some with long arrest records, all of whom had something to gain from testifying against their former associates. They suggested that these men were embellishing or even fabricating stories in an effort to please prosecutors. When it came to the tapes, the defense highlighted the indistinct audio quality and the possibility that words had been misheard or taken out of context. They suggested alternative meanings for phrases the government presented as incriminating, framing them as exaggerated talk or complaints rather than concrete plans. On the loan sharking charges, defense counsel advanced a further argument rooted in the very nature of the new extortionate credit law. They contended that high interest alone did not prove extortion, and that borrowers who had willingly entered into agreements could not now, after falling behind, simply claim that they had been coerced. They questioned whether the law was being stretched beyond its intent to criminalize what were, at bottom, private financial arrangements between consenting adults. Underlying all these legal maneuvers was an effort to reshape the jury's perception of Angelo Jip DeCarlo himself. Defense attorneys presented him as a frail, aging man with serious health problems, more a victim of overzealous prosecutors than a mastermind of anything. They emphasized that he had no prior convictions for serious violent crimes, that much of the alleged conduct rested on the words of people with powerful motives to lie, and that the government was relying on new, untested statutes to target someone it had long wanted to bring down. Prosecutors countered by returning again and again to the pattern revealed in their evidence. They did not ask jurors to rely on any single witness or recording. Instead, they asked them to consider how the pieces fit together. The borrowers who heard his name invoked as the person behind their debts, the associates who described delivering cash and seeking his approval, the tapes in which a voice identified as his calmly discussed loans, late payments, and in the government's view, the elimination of a potential informant. The atmosphere in the courtroom reflected the gravity of the case. Uniformed marshals maintained a visible presence. Spectators were searched before entering. Jurors were instructed not to read news accounts or discuss the case with anyone outside their ranks. For days at a time, testimony delved into the mechanics of illegal finance, the ways fear could be communicated without explicit threats, and the culture of loyalty and silence that made such systems difficult to crack. Outside, the trial drew attention as part of a broader narrative. Newspapers described it as a landmark test of the 1968 extortionate credit law, noting that if prosecutors secured a conviction, it would strengthen their hand against similar operations nationwide. Some stories linked the case to a growing federal focus on organized crime, placing DeCarlo alongside better-known bosses in a loose tableau of the national underworld. Others concentrated on the local impact, quoting anonymous business owners and residents who spoke of long-standing worry about loan sharking in their communities. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. The judge's instructions were long and careful. He explained the elements of each charge, the standard of proof required, and the considerations the jurors should apply when weighing the words of cooperating witnesses. He stressed that they were not to decide based on whether they believed organized crime was a social problem in general, but on whether the government had proved that this defendant had committed the specific offenses alleged. Deliberations stretched over several days. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom filled with a tense quiet as the foreperson stood. On the core extortionate credit counts, the verdict was guilty. The jury accepted the government's argument that the combination of exorbitant interest, the lender's reputation, and the pattern of pressure described by witnesses met the statutory definition of extortionate loans and collections. On the conspiracy to commit murder charge, they again found DeCarlo guilty, concluding that the recorded conversations and corroborating testimony showed an agreement to seek out someone to kill the man perceived as a threat, even though the plan had never culminated in an actual attack. As the clerk read the verdicts, DeCarlo's expression remained composed. He glanced briefly at his lawyers, then toward the benches where a few relatives and longtime associates sat. Reporters scribbled furiously, aware that this was the moment their editors had been waiting for. The conviction of a man long described in cautious terms as a reputed mob figure, now found by a federal jury to have orchestrated illegal loans and participated in a plot to arrange a killing. Defense counsel immediately announced their intention to appeal, but the trial phase was over. The focus shifted to sentencing. In federal practice, judges consider not only the bare statutory ranges but also the broader context, the defendant's history, the scale of the conduct, the need to deter others. At the sentencing hearing, prosecutors argued that DeCarlo's age should not obscure the seriousness of his offenses. They portrayed him as a long-time participant in organized crime who had profited handsomely from the misery of others, and who, even near the end of his career, had been willing to contemplate lethal measures to protect his interests. The defense, by contrast, stressed his deteriorating health. Medical reports submitted to the court detailed heart problems and other ailments. Family members portrayed him, within the limits permitted by the rules of evidence, as a devoted relative whose imprisonment would devastate those who depended on him. His attorneys asked the judge to impose as lenient a sentence as the law allowed, suggesting that a lengthy term would, in practical effect, amount to a life sentence for a man of his age. The judge's remarks from the bench reflected the tension between compassion for the individual and concern for the broader community. He acknowledged DeCarlo's age and health, but he also spoke firmly about the damage loan sharking inflicted on working people and small businesses, and about the corrosive effect of organized crime on public trust. The extortionate credit law, he noted, had been passed to confront precisely the kind of exploitation the jury had found here. To impose only a token punishment, he suggested, would undermine that legislative intent. In the end, the court sentenced Angelo DeCarlo to a substantial term in federal prison, more than a decade behind bars, along with financial penalties. Portions of the sentence related to the loan sharking counts, others to the conspiracy charge. The judge made clear that the punishment was meant both to reflect the seriousness of the conduct and to send a message that those who financed and directed such operations would be held accountable, regardless of age or outward bearing. Efforts to secure DeCarlo's release pending appeal were largely unsuccessful. His lawyers argued that the issues surrounding the new extortionate credit statute and the admissibility of the electronic surveillance raised substantial questions that higher courts needed to resolve, and that, given his health, it was unjust to keep him incarcerated while that process played out. Prosecutors countered that the evidence had been overwhelming, that the trial had been conducted scrupulously within the law, and that there was no guarantee appeals would be resolved quickly. Ultimately, the court declined to allow him to remain free on bond, while his attorneys pursued the case in the appellate courts. He began serving his sentence in a federal facility, joining a population that included both ordinary offenders and a scattering of men from the same underworld he had inhabited on the outside. For someone who had long orchestrated his affairs from the relative freedom of restaurants and social clubs, the regimented schedule and loss of autonomy in prison marked a profound change. Meanwhile, the appeals process moved forward. His lawyers took the case to the United States Court of Appeals, challenging the conviction on several fronts. They argued that the extortionate credit provisions of the Consumer Credit Protection Act were unconstitutionally vague, that they allowed juries to infer criminal intent too easily from interest rates and reputation. They attacked the wiretap and bug evidence, contending that the government's applications had not met the strict necessity requirements of Title III, and that some of the interceptions had captured privileged or irrelevant conversations in violation of the law. They also questioned the sufficiency of the evidence on the conspiracy count, asserting that talk about taking care of a troublesome associate did not amount to a concrete agreement to commit murder. These arguments were considered carefully by the appellate judges, who were mindful that they were among the first to interpret and apply the new extortion and surveillance statutes in the organized crime context. In written opinions issued after months of briefing and argument, the court rejected the defense's core claims. It held that the extortionate credit provisions provided adequate guidance when read in light of their legislative history and the specific facts of the case. It found that the government had followed the required procedures for electronic surveillance, and that any incidental overcollection of irrelevant conversations had been minimized and did not prejudice the defendant's rights. On the conspiracy count, the court pointed to the combination of recorded conversations and corroborating testimony as sufficient to support the jury's finding of an unlawful agreement. With the conviction affirmed and further appeals to the Supreme Court either declined or unsuccessful, the legal avenues that might have led to reversal narrowed. For Angelo DeCarlo, the practical result was that his sentence stood. He settled into the routines of federal incarceration at a time when his body was less able to bear the strain. Medical staff treated his ailments, but reports circulated back to his family and lawyers that his condition was worsening. Visitors described an older man whose physical presence had diminished, even if his mind and sense of pride remained intact. Outside the prison walls, however, his name did not fade into obscurity. The very factors that had made his case a priority for prosecutors, the new laws it tested, the high rank he was believed to have held within the Genovese family, ensured that it remained a reference point in discussions of organized crime enforcement. Law journals analyzed the appellate rulings, using them to advise future prosecutors on how best to structure extortionate credit cases. Congressional staffers tracking the effectiveness of anti-racketeering legislation cited his conviction as evidence that the statutes were having the intended impact. Within law enforcement circles, the case was often mentioned as a hard-won success. Agents and prosecutors who had spent much of their careers chasing higher-ups who always seemed a step removed from direct criminal acts could point to DeCarlo as proof that patience and new tools could, at least sometimes, bridge that gap. They were well aware that many others remained at large, and that organized crime as a whole had not been dismantled. But the fact remained that a man widely regarded as a regional power in the Genovese network was serving a substantial federal sentence on charges that struck at the financial core of his influence. At the same time, currents were gathering that would, within a few years, alter the course of his remaining time. His attorneys continued to press not only legal arguments but humanitarian ones, submitting fresh medical reports and petitions for a reduction of sentence on compassionate grounds. They argued that his worsening health rendered continued incarceration punitive beyond any legitimate aim, and that he posed no realistic threat if allowed to spend his final years under supervision outside prison walls. Those pleas, initially addressed to the sentencing judge and to the Bureau of Prisons, met limited sympathy. The seriousness of the underlying crimes and the broader example his case represented loomed large. Requests for sentence reduction were denied, administrative remedies moved slowly. As options within the judicial and correction systems dwindled, attention turned to a different, more exceptional mechanism: executive clemency, the constitutional power of the President of the United States to commute sentences or grant pardons. It was through that channel, rarely invoked in cases involving convicted organized crime figures, that Angelo DeCarlo's story would intersect with a political world far beyond the streets where his career had begun, drawing into its orbit national figures who, for reasons of friendship, admiration, or influence, would argue that this aging mobster deserved mercy from the highest office in the land. By the early 1970s, the presidency of Richard Nixon had become closely associated in the public mind with the language of law and order. The administration spoke often of cracking down on crime, especially organized crime. New statutes, new FBI priorities, and high-profile prosecutions all pointed in the same direction. A federal government determined to show that no one, however connected, was beyond its reach. In that context, the idea that a convicted Genovese family loan shark from New Jersey might receive mercy from the White House seemed, at first glance, improbable. Yet the same years that saw the expansion of federal power against the underworld also saw the continued intertwining of politics, celebrity, and influence. It was in that tangle of relationships that Angelo DeCarlo's case found a narrow, unexpected path. The formal route to presidential clemency ran through the Department of Justice. Prisoners or their attorneys could petition for commutation of sentence, a reduction in the length of time to be served, usually on grounds of extraordinary circumstance, severe illness, clear inequity compared with similar cases, or evidence of rehabilitation. These petitions were reviewed by the Office of the Pardon Attorney, which gathered input from prosecutors, judges, the Bureau of Prisons, and sometimes law enforcement agencies like the FBI, then made recommendations to the Attorney General and, ultimately, to the President. In DeCarlo's case, his lawyers built their appeal around his failing health. Medical reports from the federal facility where he was held painted a grim picture: heart disease, kidney problems, other chronic conditions that were unlikely to improve behind bars. They argued that continued incarceration served no real deterrent purpose, that a man in his 70s, visibly weakened, was no longer a meaningful threat to public safety. On a human level, such arguments could be compelling. Even some officials who had spent their careers battling organized crime acknowledged, in private, that the spectacle of a visibly ill, elderly inmate raised difficult questions about punishment and mercy. But when those officials looked at the name on the petition, Angelo DeCarlo, they also saw the years of work that had gone into bringing him to justice, the victims whose lives had been scarred by debts and intimidation, and the symbolic weight of his conviction under the new extortionate credit laws. Prosecutors in Newark, who had secured that conviction, were not eager to see him released early, nor were many of the agents who had spent long nights listening to wiretaps and following him through North Jersey streets. Their submissions to the Justice Department tended to be cautious in tone but clear in effect. They did not favor clemency. What tipped the balance? According to later accounts and FBI memoranda released under public records laws, was not only the legal petition, but the intervention of people with stature in entertainment and politics, most notably Frank Sinatra. Sinatra's ties to New Jersey and to the Italian-American communities in which DeCarlo had operated were deep. Born in Hoboken, he had built his career in an era when nightclub entertainment and organized crime frequently overlapped. For decades, FBI files had tracked his occasional contacts with underworld figures in various cities, including New Jersey. Those files did not prove that he was formally involved in criminal enterprises, but they reflected official unease about the company he sometimes kept. By the late 1960s, Sinatra had also become an influential political figure. He had campaigned enthusiastically for John F. Kennedy in 1960, then broke with the Kennedy family after the administration distanced itself from him in the wake of stories about his association with mobster Sam Giancana. Over time, his loyalties shifted toward Republicans. By the time Nixon sought re-election in 1972, Sinatra had become an ally, performing at events and lending his celebrity to the campaign. Within that web of personal and political relationships, several biographers and investigative reporters later wrote, Sinatra took an interest in DeCarlo's plight. Accounts differ on the details, whether Sinatra had been a close friend of DeCarlo, whether they had primarily crossed paths in the context of Newark's entertainment scene, or whether Sinatra saw the case more broadly as an example of harsh treatment for an aging man he believed to be dying. But a consistent thread in the publicly available record is that he used his access to those in power to advocate for clemency. FBI memoranda from the period, later made public, refer to Sinatra approaching senior Justice Department officials about DeCarlo's case. Some reports mention conversations with Attorney General John Mitchell, Nixon's powerful and politically attuned chief law enforcement officer. Mitchell, who oversaw both the administration's aggressive anti-crime initiatives and its more discreet political calculations, was well positioned to influence how the president viewed any particular clemency request. To be clear, the official paperwork on DeCarlo's commutation framed the decision in humanitarian terms. The Justice Department's summary for the White House emphasized his age and medical condition, noting that prison doctors considered his ailments serious and that his life expectancy was uncertain. It may also have mentioned, as such memos sometimes did, the time he had already served and the relative rarity of such requests from inmates with serious health problems. Yet those bare facts cannot be separated from the informal advocacy that surrounded them. In the world of high-level politics, the knowledge that a request is backed by a figure like Frank Sinatra, someone whose support the president valued and whose public image the White House cultivated, could carry weight, even if rarely admitted openly. For Nixon, who in 1972 was eager to court ethnic and working-class voters, especially those of Italian descent in key states, a gesture seen as compassionate toward an Italian-American prisoner might have seemed doubly attractive. Meanwhile, in New Jersey, DeCarlo's name retained complicated connotations within Italian-American communities. Some saw him as an emblem of the very stereotypes they were trying to escape, a relic of an era when politicians and reporters too readily equated Italian heritage with organized crime. Others, particularly those who had known him personally in social or entertainment circles, spoke of personal kindnesses or loans extended in times of need, seldom mentioning the larger system of exploitation of which those gestures were a part. When word circulated that Sinatra was speaking up on his behalf, reactions ranged from disbelief to resigned recognition of the power celebrity could wield. The formal decision reached the public in late 1972. Just before Christmas, the White House announced that President Nixon had commuted the sentence of Angelo DeCarlo among a batch of year-end clemency actions. The official explanation cited his serious illness and advanced age. There was no reference to Sinatra, to the Genovese family, or to the years of investigative effort that had put him behind bars. For those closest to the case, however, the news landed with far more force than a routine line in a press release. Agents and prosecutors who had lived with the DeCarlo investigation for years felt that the ground had shifted under them. Many believed, based on their experience and the continuing influence they attributed to him, that he remained dangerous in the sense that he embodied a model of organized crime leadership, quiet, calculating, insulated, that the law was only beginning to reach. To see him walk free years before his sentence expired struck them as a deep defeat. Some law enforcement officials voiced their frustration privately to reporters. A few went on the record in measured language, questioning the message such a commutation sent. The country had been told that the administration was engaged in a tough, principled battle against organized crime. They noted. How did releasing a convicted mob loan shark fit that narrative? Their criticisms gained little immediate traction, with a public more focused on the Vietnam War, rising crime rates in their own neighborhoods, and in 1972, the unfolding but still poorly understood scandal surrounding a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex. For DeCarlo's family and remaining loyalists, the commutation had an entirely different meaning. It was, quite simply, the difference between expecting that he would die in prison and knowing that he would spend at least some of his final months at home. When he was released from federal custody, he emerged visibly frail. Photographs from the period show a man whose shoulders had stooped further since his days on the steps of the Newark courthouse, his face lined, his clothes hanging loosely on a diminished frame. His return to New Jersey did not lead to a triumphant resumption of his old routines. Federal and local law enforcement kept a close, if discreet, watch on his movements. Every visit to a restaurant or club, every meeting with a familiar face, risked being observed and noted. At the same time, his health genuinely limited his activities. Accounts from those who saw him in 1973 describe someone who spent much of his time at home, who moved slowly when he did venture out, and who was preoccupied, like many seriously ill people, with doctor's appointments and the demands of treatment. The underworld he had once helped oversee was itself in flux. The early 1970s saw internal tensions within the Genovese family and other New York organizations, as generational changes, law enforcement pressure, and shifting economic opportunities reshaped the landscape. New statutes, most notably the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, passed in 1970, gave prosecutors unprecedented tools to attack entire criminal enterprises rather than isolated acts. Younger prosecutors in New York and New Jersey were beginning to experiment with RICO indictments that would, over the next decade, erode the impunity of many long-standing bosses and capos. In that sense, DeCarlo's release came at a transitional moment. He had risen in an era when the core of organized crime's power lay in loans, gambling, and labor racketeering, conducted through face-to-face relationships and enforced by personal reputation. The upcoming years would increasingly see that model challenged not just by arrests and individual trials, but by sweeping conspiracy cases that attacked the very idea of the family as a shield. Whether he fully grasped this shift in his final months is difficult to say. The surviving record offers few direct glimpses into his thinking. Unlike some contemporaries who gave interviews or wrote self-justifying memoirs, Angelo DeCarlo left no extended public reflections on his life. The closest the historical record comes are second-hand recollections by relatives, associates, and investigators, filtered through their own perspectives and agendas. From these fragments, a few themes emerge. Some who visited him after his release recall a man who remained proud, who bristled at suggestions that he ask for help or admit vulnerability, but who also expressed bitterness about what he saw as betrayals by former associates. Others remember remarks that hinted at a degree of fatalism, an acceptance that the world had moved on, and that his time as a player, for better or worse, was over. If he entertained thoughts of trying to reassert active control in the underworld, there is little reliable evidence of it. Law enforcement, on guard for any sign that his commuted sentence might become a loophole for renewed criminal leadership, saw no such resurgence before illness intervened decisively. Within less than a year of his release, his health deteriorated sharply. In October 1973, Angelo DeCarlo died in New Jersey, reportedly from complications related to the same ailments that had formed the basis of the clemency petitions. His death did not produce front-page headlines across the country. National newspapers noted his passing in brief items that referred to him as a convicted racketeer whose sentence was commuted by President Nixon. In New Jersey, Coverage was somewhat more extensive, recalling his conviction, his long alleged role in Genovese-linked operations, and the controversy surrounding his early release. Obituaries were constrained by libel laws. Many described him cautiously as an alleged mafia leader, even in the wake of a federal conviction. Within law enforcement circles, the reactions were mixed. Some agents and prosecutors, human beings with a sense of proportion, expressed a kind of resigned sympathy at the spectacle of an old man dying after years of illness, whatever his past deeds. Others focused on what they considered the unresolved imbalance, a career they believed had inflicted enormous unrecorded harm on debtors, businesses, and unions, concluded not with a full term served, but with a shortened sentence and a return home granted by a president who had made political capital out of promises to be tough on organized crime. As the 1970s progressed, however, his name resurfaced in a new and unexpected context, as a footnote in the expanding investigations into the Nixon administration itself. As congressional committees and journalists dug into the broader patterns of influence and abuse of power that had characterized the White House's dealings, the DeCarlo commutation was sometimes cited as an example of the way political favor and celebrity intervention could bend a process the public assumed was purely legalistic. In hearings and reports examining the use of presidential clemency, critics pointed to his case, alongside others, to argue that the system was vulnerable to inconsistency and hidden pressure. How, they asked, could an administration that prided itself on its campaign against the mafia justify leniency for a man whose conviction had been hailed as a major victory in that very campaign? The answers, when they came, were often couched in bureaucratic language about medical evaluations and individualized mercy. But the questions themselves ensured that Angelo DeCarlo's name would remain part of the documentary trail of the Nixon years, alongside far better-known scandals. Beyond the realm of politics and policy, his story continued to echo in the cultural life of New Jersey and of the broader Italian-American community. Musicians and entertainers who had known him, or known those around him, sometimes mentioned him obliquely in interviews or memoirs, as a presence in the back of a club, as a man who could make problems disappear, as someone whose favor could be useful and whose anger was to be avoided. These accounts, colored by nostalgia and the tendency of popular culture to romanticize the underworld, often glossed over the more unpleasant realities of loan sharking and coercion that the trial record had laid bare. For historians, separating myth from reality became an ongoing task. The bare facts that Angelo DeCarlo was a Genovese-linked New Jersey figure convicted in 1969 of extortionate credit offenses and conspiracy to commit murder, that he received a sentence commuted by President Nixon in 1972 on health grounds, and that he died the following year, formed a relatively secure skeleton. Around those bones clustered stories, some well-supported, others more speculative, about his connections to famous entertainers, his precise role within the Genovese family's hierarchy, and the influence his case had on the development of federal law. What remained unmistakable was the arc of his life as an illustration of broader patterns. Born into poverty in early 20th century Italy, raised in the immigrant neighborhoods of New Jersey, he rode the currents of prohibition, depression, and post-war urban change into a position of power in the hidden economy of gambling and illicit credit. For decades, local corruption, limited investigative tools, and a culture of silence protected him and those like him. When the federal government finally acquired the legal weapons to reach men at his level, he became one of the first to feel their full force. Yet even then, his fate was not determined solely by statute and evidence. Personal connections, shifting political alliances, and the persuasive weight of a world-famous singer's appeal all played their part. His early release, granted by a president whose broader legacy would soon be overshadowed by scandal, underscored how uneven the pursuit of justice could be, particularly when it intersected with celebrity and power. In the end, Angelo DeCarlo left behind neither a clear confession nor a forceful denial. The record that survives is a patchwork of court transcripts, surveillance reports, legislative debates, and the recollections of those who knew him from different angles. As a threatening creditor, as a dependable provider of illicit capital, as a quiet patron in back rooms, as a symbol of organized crime's reach, as an aging, sick man seeking mercy. It is out of that patchwork that any meaningful understanding of his life must be assembled, and it is from that understanding that questions about his broader significance for New Jersey, for federal law enforcement, and for the cultural memory of the American underworld begin to take shape. In the years immediately following Angelo DeCarlo's death in October 1973, his name receded from the daily work of law enforcement, but it did not disappear. His case, preserved in court opinions, investigative files, and internal memoranda, became part of the institutional memory of how the federal government had finally learned to reach figures at his level. When young prosecutors and agents arrived in Newark in the mid-1970s, they found DeCarlo at once in their casebooks and in the stories told by older colleagues, an example of both what had been accomplished and what still remained unfinished. The legal tools that had helped bring him down were themselves still new. Title II of the Consumer Credit Protection Act, the extortionate credit provisions used in his prosecution, had been upheld on constitutional grounds in 1971 by the Supreme Court in Perez v. United States, a case arising from loan sharking in Brooklyn. In Perez, the court accepted Congress's argument that even seemingly local loan transactions, when part of an organized criminal pattern, affected interstate commerce enough to justify federal intervention. That ruling gave statutory backbone to prosecutions like the one that followed against DeCarlo and his associates in New Jersey. In appellate decisions around the country, courts cited Perez and then cases such as United States v. DeCarlo as they refined how the extortionate credit laws should be interpreted. Opinions dug into questions that were once primarily the stuff of street rumor. How high must an interest rate be before it can be presumed extortionate? How much weight should be given to a lender's reputation in the community? What kinds of fear, of economic harm, of physical harm, must prosecutors show? In this way, conduct that had long flourished in a shadow world of whispers and innuendo was gradually translated into the precise language of legal doctrine. The effect of that translation reached far beyond North Jersey. Throughout the 1970s, as law enforcement stepped up its efforts against organized crime in cities from Boston to Los Angeles, loan sharking prosecutions became a staple of federal dockets. Investigators looked to the DeCarlo case not only as a historical example, but as a practical blueprint. They studied which forms of evidence had held up on appeal, how to structure indictments to reflect both the financing and the collection sides of a loan network, and how to explain to juries the subtle forms of pressure that made such loans coercive, even when no explicit threat was spoken. At the same time, an even more sweeping statute, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO, began to reshape the legal battlefield. Enacted in 1970, RICO allowed prosecutors to treat criminal organizations themselves as enterprises that could be attacked through patterns of racketeering activity. Instead of charging a loan shark with a single extortionate loan, or a boss with a single conspiracy, the government could argue that repeated acts of gambling, extortion, fraud, and other specified offenses were all part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. In the first years after RICO's passage, many prosecutors proceeded cautiously. The statute was complex, its constitutional contours untested. But by the late 1970s and early 1980s, bold RICO cases were being brought against major mob families, including the Genovese organization to which DeCarlo had belonged. In New Jersey, federal and state authorities built RICO and related prosecutions around some of the same structures that had been illuminated in the DeCarlo investigation. The flow of money from gambling and loans up to higher-ranking figures, the use of union locals and construction firms as levers of control, the reliance on reputation, and the implied threat of harm to keep victims in line. Key Genovese figures operating in North Jersey, men who had once worked beside or under DeCarlo, or who had moved into the spaces left when older capos died or were imprisoned, found themselves named in racketeering indictments. Some were connected to the notorious Boyado faction that had long dominated Essex County. Others worked more closely with Teamsters leader Anthony "Tony Provenzano, whose control of certain union locals and alleged role in various acts of violence made him a central target of law enforcement. Although DeCarlo himself was no longer present, the financial and organizational patterns his case had helped expose were the ones prosecutors now presented to juries under the RICO framework. Within the Genovese family, the generation that had come of age with DeCarlo was gradually giving way. Men like Vito Genovese himself, Carlo Gambino of the rival family, and long-serving capos had died or been marginalized. New leadership, including Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, emerged in New York with corresponding shifts in the family's New Jersey operations. Yet the core rackets, gambling, loan sharking, labor influence, remained. The difference from a legal standpoint was that each of these activities was now a potential building block in broader, racketeering cases aimed at dismantling not just individual crews, but the system as a whole. Law enforcement's internal view of the DeCarlo case evolved in this context. In the 1960s, it had been a culmination, the rare successful prosecution of a high-ranking loan shark. By the 1980s, it was seen more as a precursor, an early example of the kind of comprehensive approach that RICO made possible. Agents and prosecutors used transcripts from the 1969 trial and training sessions, illustrating how to explain structured criminal behavior to juries unfamiliar with the Underworld's informal rules. They pored over the wiretap affidavits and technical logs, refining best practices for electronic surveillance that now extended to sophisticated bugs in social clubs, union offices, and even the occasional private residence. Outside government, the DeCarlo story was slowly being woven into a very different narrative. The cultural fascination with the mafia that took hold in American popular life in the 1970s and beyond. The release of Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather in 1972, followed by its sequel in 1974, gave millions of viewers an operatic, stylized vision of organized crime, one that emphasized family loyalty, codes of honor, and tragic conflict. Although based loosely on events and figures mostly rooted in New York and Sicily, the films shaped public expectations of what men like DeCarlo must have been like. Subsequent movies and books, such as Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets and later Goodfellas, offered grittier but still dramatized depictions of life in the underworld. New Jersey, once a backdrop, moved closer to the center in the public imagination, particularly with television series set in the state that blended everyday suburban life with mob storylines. These works were not documentaries. They compressed, rearranged, and embellished for dramatic effect. Yet they drew on the same reservoir of real cases and personalities that had included DeCarlo, Boyado, Provenzano, and others. Occasionally, reporters and authors pointed directly to him. In long-form magazine pieces and books on Sinatra, on Nixon, or on the Genovese family, chapters or sections were devoted to the loan shark capo from Newark whose sentence the president had commuted. These accounts, depending on their sources, emphasized different aspects of his life. Some highlighted his role as a local boss who controlled bookmaking and loan operations, and who, according to informants, had a say in how contracts and union disputes were handled. Others fixated on the connection to Sinatra, painting a picture of backroom deals and personal loyalty stretching from Hoboken bars to the Oval Office. Historians and serious journalists tried to separate what could be documented from what rested on rumor. They combed through court files, FBI documents released under the Freedom of Information Act, and, where available, personal papers of political figures. They compared recollections by former agents and mob associates, aware that everyone had incentives to cast themselves in a certain light. Some found evidence of Sinatra's inquiries on DeCarlo's behalf. Others noted that the White House clemency files, while thin on explicit references to celebrity pressure, nonetheless showed that his petition had received an exceptional degree of high-level attention. For the Italian-American community, the cultural moment was more fraught. On one hand, the 1970s and 1980s saw increased visibility for Italian Americans in politics, business, academia, and the arts. Governors, mayors, and members of Congress came from families that had once lived in the same crowded neighborhoods as men like DeCarlo. On the other hand, the surge of mafia-themed entertainment and news coverage risked reinforcing a narrow, sensational image of Italian heritage. Civil rights organizations and community leaders campaigned against what they saw as a lazy tendency in media and law enforcement to conflate ethnic identity with criminality. In this debate, DeCarlo's name occasionally appeared as a point of contention. Advocates for fair representation argued that constant reference to a small number of mob figures, DeCarlo among them, distorted perceptions of the millions of law-abiding Italian Americans whose lives had nothing to do with organized crime. They pointed out that, statistically, most crimes in the United States were committed by people of other backgrounds, and that the mafia, while real and harmful, was a limited phenomenon. Law enforcement officials responded that ignoring the ethnic and familial networks that sustained certain criminal groups would be irresponsible. They insisted that their focus was on conduct, not ancestry. Within academic criminology, scholars used his case as a focal point for broader discussions about how organized crime adapts to legal pressure. They noted that DeCarlo had operated successfully for decades in an environment where informal ties, local corruption, and limited investigative tools shielded him from serious legal consequence. When that environment changed, through improved surveillance, new statutes, and shifts in political will, his vulnerability was exposed. But the very need for a presidential commutation to bring his sentence in line with his declining health raised questions about how societies balance retribution, deterrence, and mercy in dealing with entrenched criminal figures. The release of previously secret FBI and Justice Department documents in the 1980s and 1990s added layers of detail. Through Freedom of Information Act requests, journalists and researchers obtained copies of the top hoodlum program list that had once quietly circulated within the Bureau. There, in typed columns from the 1950s and 1960s, was Angelo DeCarlo's name, often accompanied by terse notations about suspected activities, loan sharking, gambling, associates with named Genovese figures. The files also contained surveillance reports describing mundane scenes, a lunch at a certain restaurant, a conversation in a club that, taken together, had once formed the skeletal outline of an investigation. Reading those reports decades later, one is struck by their mixture of specificity and vagueness. Agents recorded license plate numbers, times of arrival and departure, snippets of conversation caught at a distance. Yet they often lacked context. A meeting could be about anything from family matters to the division of illegal proceeds. It was only when such fragments were combined with witness statements and recordings that a coherent picture emerged. The DeCarlo case thus became a kind of primer in the use and limitation of surveillance, a demonstration of how much work was required to translate observation into proof, and a reminder that even extensive monitoring could leave critical gaps. His commutation, too, took on clearer contours in the light of declassified materials. White House logs showed the timing of visits and calls by figures like Sinatra during the period when clemency petitions were under review. Internal Justice Department memos trace the flow of recommendations from staff attorneys to political appointees. These documents did not always provide smoking gun evidence of direct quid pro quo, but they did reveal the sensitivity of DeCarlo's case, the degree to which it was recognized as atypical, and the awareness among officials that his release could be controversial. As history moved forward, his name was sometimes invoked in discussions that would have seemed far removed from the Newark streets of his active years. When legal scholars debated the proper scope of the president's clemency power, particularly in the wake of controversial pardons and commutations by later administrations, they cited examples from decades earlier, including DeCarlo, to illustrate how pardons could entangle law, politics, and celebrity. When analysts wrote about Nixon's complex relationship with law enforcement and crime policy, they noted that the same White House that had championed new anti-racketeering laws had also, in a handful of instances, exercised mercy toward men who were, in the words of their own prosecutors, emblematic of the problem those laws sought to address. Meanwhile, on the ground in North Jersey, the world that had produced Angelo DeCarlo continued to change. The old Italian enclaves of Newark and surrounding towns were by then largely transformed. New immigrant groups, including from Latin America and Asia, had settled in many of the same neighborhoods where his generation had grown up. Social clubs that had once served as hubs for underworld meetings were closed, converted to other uses, or operating under new management. Younger residents, seeing the addresses that dotted FBI files from the 1950s and 1960s, might have had no idea of the roles those locations had played in the unseen economy of an earlier era. The nature of organized crime itself evolved. While the traditional mafia families maintained a presence in the region, they faced competition from other criminal groups, drug trafficking organizations, street gangs, and more fluid, network conspiracies less bound by ethnicity or neighborhood. Loan sharking still existed, but it competed with more complicated financial schemes, including frauds that exploited emerging technologies. For criminals willing to use violence and intimidation, the lure of narcotics profits often overshadowed the slower, more methodical gains of old-style gambling and illegal lending. For some in law enforcement, DeCarlo's story came to represent a kind of hinge point between eras, the tail end of a system built on personal contact, face-to-face pressure, and neighborhood reputations, and the beginning of a period in which both crime and its investigation would be increasingly shaped by sophisticated technology and global connections. His career had spanned the time from prohibition to computerized banking. The tools used against him, wiretaps and extortion statutes, had been cutting edge in their day, but would soon seem almost quaint compared to digital forensics and international task forces. Yet the human dynamics at the center of his life, the exploitation of desperation, the manipulation of loyalty and fear, the use of financial leverage to gain control over others' choices, remained sadly familiar. When, in the 1990s and early 2000s, new waves of predatory lending scandals and debt collection abuses came to light in entirely different sectors of the economy, some commentators drew analogies to the loan sharking rackets of mid-century Newark. The legal lines were different, the participants not generally connected to organized crime, but the underlying imbalance of power between creditor and debtor resonated with the patterns first brought into clear focus in cases like DeCarlo. Within this broader landscape of historical reflection, Angelo DeCarlo occupies a peculiar place. He was neither the most powerful boss of his era nor the most flamboyant. He did not run a major national family, nor did he become a household name in the way of certain more publicized figures. His influence was regional, exercised in back rooms and through intermediaries rather than in showy public displays. Yet because his case sat at the intersection of emerging laws, evolving investigative techniques, celebrity involvement, and presidential decision-making. It has continued to draw attention from those interested in how societies confront entrenched criminal systems. The archival traces he left behind, an Italian birth record, a passenger manifest, a scattering of early police mentions, the thick files of a federal investigation, the transcript of a trial, the brief notation of a presidential signature on a commutation order, and finally an obituary, do not tell a straightforward moral tale. They point instead to a life in which individual choices and broader social forces were tightly bound. To understand Angelo DeCarlo is to confront questions not only about guilt and punishment, but about the conditions that allowed a man of modest beginnings to become, for a time, a feared and influential figure in the shadows of American economic life, and about the mix of law, politics, and culture that finally brought his career to an end. Seen from a distance of decades, the documentary record of Angelo DeCarlo's life looks comprehensive. Court transcripts, FBI reports, presidential files, newspaper archives. Yet when one looks closely, the gaps are as revealing as the details. The sources that speak most often, agents' memoranda, prosecutors' briefs, judicial opinion, are the voices of the state. They illuminate what he did when he came under scrutiny, how he behaved in the courtroom, how he fit into the structures of the Genovese family. They say far less about what his rise looked like from street level, about how his choices affected the daily lives of those who crossed his path, or about how he understood his own place in the world he helped shape. Even basic facts remain uncertain or contested in the secondary literature. The precise contours of his early involvement in crime, the timeline by which he rose from runner to overseer, the full scope of his financial interests in legitimate businesses. These can only be inferred from fragmentary mentions in investigation files and from the recollections of people whose memories were shaped by fear, loyalty, or self-interest. Historians must navigate between the tendency of former associates to magnify a dead man's status and the equally strong impulse within law enforcement narratives to cast him as the embodiment of a system they spent careers fighting. In that sense, DeCarlo's story is a case study in the limits of what can be known about organized crime. By design, the networks in which he operated left as little paper as possible. Deals were sealed with handshakes, not contracts. Threats were implied, not written down. Even the legends that circulate in popular culture, stories of meetings in back rooms, of quiet interventions on behalf of favored entertainers, often lack documentary corroboration. They tell us as much about how later generations wanted to imagine him as they do about what he actually did. What can be said with confidence is that his life traced a path common to many in his milieu, but with consequences that reached far beyond the typical. Born into a country in turmoil, he was carried by migration into American cities at a time when immigrant communities faced discrimination and economic marginalization. The underworld in which he made his career did not emerge in a vacuum. It grew out of conditions in which legal avenues for advancement were limited and trust in official institutions was thin. Informal networks of family, village, and neighborhood became both safety net and, for some, a platform for illicit enterprise. From Prohibition through the Depression, DeCarlo and his contemporaries learned to see opportunity in the gaps between law and demand. People wanted to drink. The law said they could not. People wanted to gamble. The state either banned or tightly controlled it. People needed credit. Formal lenders were cautious, discriminatory, or absent from certain neighborhoods and industries. Men like DeCarlo stepped into those spaces, offering goods and services that the legal market would not, and attaching to them a price far beyond the monetary. Submission, silence, and the acceptance of a system in which disputes were settled not by judges but by reputation and fear. His rise within that system was neither inevitable nor uniform. Most of his peers in Newark's Italian-American neighborhoods chose other paths, often under far more difficult circumstances than his. But he possessed qualities that the underworld prized: caution, reliability, an ability to maintain order among subordinate operators, and a willingness to apply pressure without drawing undue attention. By mid-century, these attributes had placed him in a position where he could broker between New Jersey street-level rackets and the trans-Hudson power center of the Genovese family. The costs of that role radiated outward in ways rarely captured in headline stories. Every illegal loan extended under his authority represented not just a cash transaction, but an ongoing claim over someone's life. Small business owners found their payrolls, inventories, and even ownership stakes gradually absorbed by obligations they could not clear. Gamblers struggling with addiction tumbled into spirals of debt that strained families and friendships. Union locals, meant to protect workers' interests, could be steered instead toward contracts and policies that served the financial needs of a handful of mob-linked lenders. The trial record and witness statements from his 1969 conviction give only a partial glimpse into this human toll. Borrowers testified to fear and sleeplessness, to changing their routines to avoid collectors, to the shame of seeing family members confronted about their debts. These accounts were, by necessity, selective and ordered to fit legal categories. Behind each one, there were likely many others who never came forward, either because they were too afraid or because, long after their debts were paid or their businesses lost, they saw no benefit in reopening old wounds. It was the scale and systemic nature of such harm that ultimately pushed Congress and the courts to adapt. When federal law began to recognize extortionate credit as more than a private misfortune, as a component of a broader pattern that distorted markets and undermined public trust, men like DeCarlo moved from the periphery of national concern to its center. His conviction, relying on the early use of extortionate credit statutes and sanctioned electronic surveillance, marked a moment when the law caught up, however imperfectly, with a reality long felt in the neighborhoods where he had operated. Yet the aftermath of that conviction, particularly the commutation of his sentence by President Nixon, underscored that the relationship between organized crime, the legal system, and political power was anything but straightforward. DeCarlo's case showed that even the most carefully constructed legal outcomes could be altered by decisions made far from the neighborhoods where the underlying conduct took place. The same president who championed new tools against the mafia could, under the rubric of compassion for a sick, elderly man, shorten the penalty that federal judges and jurors had deemed appropriate. The involvement of Frank Sinatra in that episode, documented in part by FBI memoranda and supported by later biographical work, adds another layer. Sinatra, an artist whose own life narrative ran from the tenements of Hoboken to global celebrity, inhabited a world where the boundaries between show business, politics, and the underworld were porous. His advocacy on behalf of DeCarlo illustrates how personal loyalties and cultural ties could intersect with high politics, shaping outcomes in ways that official paperwork rarely acknowledges openly. For students of American political history, the commutation has become a minor but telling example of the discretionary nature of executive power. Clemency is, by design, a safety valve in a system that can otherwise be rigid and indifferent to individual circumstances. But its exercise in cases involving organized crime figures has always been fraught. When mercy is extended to someone like Angelo DeCarlo, the questions that follow about fairness, influence, and consistency are not easily answered, particularly by those who bore the brunt of his activities and received no similar relief. Beyond law and politics, his story has also become a touchstone in debates about how society remembers and misremembers the underworld. Popular culture's fascination with the mafia tends to favor archetypes: the charismatic boss, the loyal soldier, the tragic anti-hero. In this repertoire, a figure like DeCarlo is at once familiar and elusive. He fits the template of the quiet, calculating capo, deeply connected yet not ostentatious, feared but not widely known outside his region. That very ordinariness from a cinematic standpoint may explain why his life, though central to legal and political developments, has been less dramatized than those of flashier contemporaries. Where he does appear, in books on Sinatra, on Nixon, on the Genovese family, in local histories of Newark and New Jersey, he tends to be a hinge figure, linking domains that are often treated separately. Through him, narratives of working-class Italian-American life intersect with accounts of systemic criminal enterprise, with the evolution of federal law, and with the story of a presidency brought low by unrelated abuses of power. His name appears in contexts as diverse as Supreme Court footnotes, FBI top hoodlum rosters, and studies of presidential clemency. Each of these uses highlights a different facet of his significance. In the neighborhoods where he once walked, that significance is more diffuse. Physical traces are faint. The social clubs where he met associates have changed names or disappeared. The restaurants have been renovated, repurposed, or replaced by new establishments serving new communities. The old First Ward of Newark, once a bastion of Italian life, had already been largely dismantled by urban renewal and demographic change before his death. For younger residents of those areas today, the name Angelo DeCarlo, if recognized at all, is more likely to come from a book or a passing mention in a documentary than from family stories. And yet, on a structural level, some of the issues his life encapsulated persist. Economic inequalities continue to create openings for predatory lending, even if the players and methods differ. Distrust of institutions remains a fact of life in many communities, sometimes, as in his youth, rooted in experiences of discrimination or official neglect. The temptation to address those gaps through informal, extra-legal networks has not vanished, whether in the form of loan shark analogs, off-the-books labor arrangements, or more complex forms of organized fraud. The contrast between his formative years and the present is stark in other respects. Today's law enforcement agencies operate in an environment saturated with digital traces. Financial transactions leave electronic footprints. Communications cross servers that can be subpoenaed. Location data from phones and vehicles can, in some circumstances, be used to reconstruct movements. Against this backdrop, the laborious surveillance that once staked out DeCarlo's favorite haunts, nodding license plates and overheard remarks, seems almost quaint. But the basic investigative challenges remain: turning information into admissible evidence, protecting civil liberties while pursuing public safety, and ensuring that laws aimed at sophisticated criminal networks do not become tools of overreach against ordinary citizens. The degree to which law enforcement has internalized the lessons of cases like DeCarlo's can be seen in modern anti-racketeering efforts. Prosecutors today are more likely to think in terms of enterprises, patterns, and structures than of isolated crimes. They are accustomed to building cases over years, using informants, surveillance, and complex statutes to reach those who give orders rather than only those who carry them out. At the same time, there is greater awareness, born of past excesses, of the need to calibrate such tools carefully, to avoid criminalizing mere association or stretching conspiracy theories beyond their evidentiary base. For communities that were once dominated by traditional mafia families, the retreat of figures like DeCarlo has brought both relief and ambiguity. The old taxes, imposed by loan sharks and union racketeers in Italian-American neighborhoods have in many places faded, but they have been replaced, in some cases, by new forms of criminal exploitation tied to drugs, human trafficking, cybercrime, or other global networks. The faces and languages have changed. The underlying dynamics of vulnerability and predation often have not. In the end, the story of Angelo DeCarlo resists simple moralizing. It would be easy to cast him solely as a villain, a man whose life's work consisted of extracting money through fear and contemplating lethal solutions to problems. It would be equally simplistic to treat him as a product of his times, a kind of inevitable outcome of migration, poverty, and prejudice. The historical record instead suggests a more demanding reading. He was a capable, intelligent individual who made choices, within constraints, but not dictated by them, that repeatedly prioritized power and profit over the well-being of others, and who did so in ways that exploited structural weaknesses in both the economy and the law. His significance, therefore, lies not in any single dramatic episode, but in how his life illuminates connections between immigrant struggle and the birth of organized crime, between local rackets and national syndicates, between ordinary financial need and extraordinary coercion, between the investigative frustrations of mid-century law enforcement and the eventual creation of legal frameworks to address them, between the rhetoric of political leaders and the quiet, often unseen ways they can bend justice in individual cases. A viewer following his trajectory from a crowded ship's manifest to a Newark loan shark's back room, from a federal courtroom to a prison infirmary, and finally to a presidential commutation file might reasonably ask what, if anything, has been learned. Perhaps the most sober answer is that societies are always, in one form or another, negotiating the boundary between law and the appetites it fails to satisfy, between power exercised openly and power wielded in the shadows. As the documentary closes, the camera might linger not on his face, captured in a handful of aging newspaper photographs, but on the spaces that framed his life. A tenement street in early morning light, echoing the neighborhoods where his family first settled. The facades of old social clubs and diners in North Jersey, now serving different patrons with different worries. The corridors of the federal courthouse in Newark, where his trial unfolded, and where, even now, new defendants file past the same wooden benches and brass railings. A shelf in an archive, where a gray box labeled with his name holds the transcripts and exhibits that outlived him. In those images, the story of Angelo DeCarlo becomes less about one man's notoriety and more about the enduring questions his life raises. How do communities confront exploitation from within as well as from without? How does the law adapt to forms of power that hide behind respectability and fear? And how do we remember figures who moved through history's shadows, not to glamorize or excuse, but to understand the world that produced them, the damage they caused, and the complicated, often halting efforts to hold them to account?